There is a pattern hiding inside every global power shift of the last 110 years. It has toppled empires, bankrupted superpowers, and redrawn the map of the world 3 separate times. And it always starts the same way. With oil. Not with armies, not with ideology, with oil. And right now, in 2025, the United States is following that exact same pattern, step by step, stage by stage. The country that turned oil into the foundation of its global power is watching that foundation crack. Most Americans have no idea it's happening, but the math is already locked in. The sequence has already started. In 1914, Britain made a single decision about oil that would give it control of half the world's proven reserves within 5 years. By 1928, that control was already slipping through its fingers. And by the 1950s, the empire that once ruled the seas couldn't even protect its own refineries. It took Britain roughly 40 years to go from oil dominance to oil dependence. Then America played the same game, faster. In 1933, a handshake in the Saudi desert set the stage. By 1945, the deal was sealed aboard a warship. By 1974, oil and the United States dollar were fused into a single system that controlled global trade. That took about 40 years to build, and it's taken less than 15 to start unraveling. And in between, OPEC proved that the weapon could be turned around. In 1973, an embargo quadrupled oil prices in 3 months. 3 months. The pattern was accelerating. And here's what should concern you. Every empire in this story followed the same 7-stage sequence. Britain completed all 7. America helped push them through it. And right now, by every measurable indicator, the United States has already completed stages 1 through 5. We are in stage 6. Stage 7 is what comes after. This is the story of how oil became the most powerful weapon in modern history, not because of what it burns, but because of the system built around who controls it, who prices it, and in what currency it trades. 3 empires, 1 pattern, 7 stages, and a clock that's ticking right now. Let me show you how it works. Every oil power shift in the last century has followed 7 stages, the same 7 in the same order, every single time. Stage 1. A rising power identifies oil as the key strategic resource and moves to secure supply before rivals do. The indicator is government-level decisions to treat oil as a matter of national security, not just commerce. Stage 2. That power builds or requires the physical infrastructure, refineries, pipelines, ports, drilling operations, that controls the flow of oil from ground to market. The indicator is direct ownership or controlling stakes in production and refining assets abroad. Stage 3. Military force is deployed, openly or covertly, to protect oil assets, secure transit routes, and deny access to competitors. The indicator is troops, naval bases, or covert operations stationed specifically near oil infrastructure. Stage 4. Treaties, conferences, and international agreements are used to legalize and formalize what was taken by force or bought under pressure. The indicator is peace deals and mandates that just happen to include oil concessions. Stage 5. The dominant power locks in structural control, pricing mechanisms, currency agreements, exclusive contracts that make its oil dominance self-reinforcing. The indicator is a single currency or single set of companies controlling the majority of global oil trade. Stage 6. Rivals, producing nations, or new powers begin to challenge the monopoly through nationalizations, alternative alliances, or competing currencies. The indicator is oil-producing nations demanding new terms or selling oil outside the dominant system. Stage 7. The old system breaks. The dominant power loses control not gradually, but in cascading failures, financial crises, lost alliances, military overextension, and a new power inherits the cycle. The indicator is the moment the world stops needing permission from the old power to buy and sell oil. That's the sequence. 7 stages. Now let me show you how it's played out, 3 times in living memory. Let's start with Britain, and let's start at the peak, because that's what makes the fall so staggering. In 1919, the British Empire controlled roughly a quarter of the Earth's land surface, 13.7 million square miles, 458 million people. The Royal Navy was the most powerful maritime force in human history, with over 1,300 vessels. London was the financial capital of the world. The pound sterling was the global reserve currency, and at the center of all of it, quietly, almost invisibly, was oil. Most people know Britain as a coal empire. That's the schoolbook version. The real story is that between 1910 and 1923, a small group of British officials, admirals, and corporate executives executed a series of decisions that gave Britain control of approximately half the world's proven oil reserves. Not through luck, not through market forces, through deliberate, calculated, government-directed strategy. The company at the center of it was the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, APOC. You know it today by a different name, BP, British Petroleum. That name isn't an accident, it's a fossil record of empire. The same company that sells you gasoline at a corner station in 2025 was founded as a tool of imperial power projection. Its majority shareholder wasn't a bank or a tycoon. It was the British government. But beneath the maps and the medals, beneath the ceremony at Versailles and the mandate declarations in San Remo, the system Britain built had a fatal flaw. It depended on two things lasting forever: military reach and diplomatic leverage. Both were already eroding before the ink was dry. This is stage one of every oil power shift. A rising or dominant power identifies oil as the strategic resource that will define the next era, and acts before anyone else fully understands what's happening. For Britain, that moment came between 1910 and 1914, driven almost entirely by one man, Winston Churchill. As First Lord of the Admiralty, Churchill pushed the Royal Navy to convert from coal to oil-fired ships. The reasons were purely military. Oil-powered vessels were faster, had greater range, and could refuel at sea. But the consequences were civilizational. Britain had coal, mountains of it beneath its own soil. Oil? Britain had almost none. So in June 1914, just weeks before the guns of August, the British government purchased a 51% controlling stake in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company for £2.2 million, roughly £289 million in today's money. This wasn't a passive investment. The government appointed two directors to the board, secured a 20-year fuel contract at preferential rates, and effectively sidelined competitors like Standard Oil and Royal Dutch Shell from Persian supplies. In a single transaction, Britain turned a private oil company into an arm of the state. Simultaneously, Britain helped form the Turkish Petroleum Company in 1914, designed to exploit Ottoman oil, a joint venture with German and Dutch partners that would be torn apart by war within months. With the resource identified and the company secured, Britain moved to stage two, capturing the physical infrastructure that turns crude in the ground into power at sea. The crown jewel was the Abadan refinery in southwestern Persia, modern-day Iran. Built on an island at the confluence of the Shatt al-Arab waterway, Abadan was by 1913 the largest oil refinery in the world. It processed crude pumped from the Masyed Soliman fields 130 miles to the northeast. Pipelines, pumping stations, storage tanks, worker housing, a port capable of loading ocean-going tankers. Britain didn't just buy oil. It built the entire extraction-to-delivery chain on foreign soil, staffed it with British engineers, and defended it with British soldiers. When Ottoman forces threatened Abadan in 1915, Britain deployed Indian Army troops to Basra, specifically to protect the refinery. Not to liberate the region, not to support local populations, to protect a pipeline. The military deployment was explicitly tied to oil infrastructure. Internal War Office memos confirm the refinery's defense was the primary objective. This is the pattern at stage two. You don't just find the resource, You build the machine that only you can operate. You make yourself indispensable to the flow. Now watch what happens when a government decides oil is worth fighting for. Not metaphorically, but literally. By 1917, Britain's military strategy in the Middle East was openly driven by oil. A naval committee that year recommended Britain control as much as possible of global petroleum. Admiral Edmund Slade's July 1918 report to the War Cabinet made the case explicit. Oil was a vital necessity for naval and military operations, and Britain must secure sources independent of American or rival supply. The military campaigns that followed were surgical. After capturing Baghdad in March 1917, British forces raced north toward Mosul, not because Mosul was militarily significant in the conventional sense, but because geological surveys suggested enormous oil deposits beneath it. British troops occupied Mosul in November 1918, days after the armistice, technically violating ceasefire terms to grab the territory before it could be negotiated away. And then there was Baku. In 1918, Britain dispatched the Dunster Force, 450 elite soldiers under Major General Lionel Dunsterville, to seize the oil fields of Baku in modern-day Azerbaijan. Baku was producing approximately 50% of the world's oil at that time. The mission failed against Bolshevik and Ottoman opposition, but the attempt tells you everything about Stage 3. When the resource is big enough, the guns follow. Here's what people don't understand about this phase of the story. This wasn't some improvised scramble. The Foreign Office, the Admiralty, the War Office, and APOC's board were coordinating in real time. Internal memos moved between Whitehall and the front lines. Oil concession maps were drawn before peace treaties were signed. The military campaigns and the corporate strategy were the same strategy. When we talk about the military-industrial complex, this is its birth certificate. Stage 4 is where force becomes law. And for Britain, that transformation happened at three tables: Paris in 1919, San Remo in 1920, and Lausanne in 1923. At the Paris Peace Conference, Prime Minister David Lloyd George arrived with a clear mandate: lock in Britain's wartime oil gains through the new international order. A 1918 Foreign Office memo, now declassified, explicitly stated that post-war control of Middle Eastern oil fields was a vital necessity, not for commerce, but for the continued supremacy of the Royal Navy. The San Remo Conference in April 1920 delivered the prize. Britain received the League of Nations mandate for Iraq, including the Mosul Vilayet and its suspected oil reserves, and APOC received exclusive concession rights. France got a 25% share in the Turkish Petroleum Company as compensation. The deal was dressed in the language of nation-building and civilizational trusteeship. The substance was oil. The Treaty of Sèvres in 1920 attempted to formally detach Mosul from Turkey. When Turkish resistance under Mustafa Kemal made Sèvres unenforceable, Britain renegotiated at Lausanne in 1923 and held firm on Mosul. Britain was willing to compromise on borders, reparations, even military presence, not on oil. By the early 1920s, Britain's oil monopoly was structural. APOC controlled Persian output. The Turkish Petroleum Company, reorganized as the Iraq Petroleum Company, controlled Iraqi fields. The Royal Navy consumed a guaranteed supply at preferential prices, and Britain controlled the choke points: Suez, the Strait of Hormuz, the refining capacity at Abadan. By 1919, Britain controlled approximately 50% of the world's proven oil reserves through direct ownership, mandates, and corporate concessions. To maintain this control cheaply, Britain adopted air power and indirect rule from 1921 onward. Air Marshal Arthur "Bomber" Harris, later famous for the Dresden bombing, cut his teeth policing Iraq from the sky. Cheaper than ground troops, equally effective at enforcing compliance. Let me show you what that actually looked like on the ground. Air Marshal Arthur Harris, the same man who would later order the firebombing of Dresden, was policing Iraqi villages from the air in the early 1920s. Bombs dropped on tribal settlements that resisted British oil infrastructure. The oil that powered the planes came from the very fields the planes were protecting. The system fed on itself. This is stage 5. The monopoly becomes self-reinforcing. The infrastructure is built, the treaties are signed, the military is deployed. The system runs on autopilot. And that's precisely when the cracks begin. The resistance came from two directions simultaneously: rivals above and subjects below. From above, the United States. American oil companies, Standard Oil of New Jersey, Standard Oil of New York, had been shut out of the Middle East by British concessions. Washington responded with the 1920 Mineral Leasing Act, barring British firms from United States oil lands unless American firms received reciprocal access abroad. The diplomatic pressure was relentless. By 1928, American companies had forced their way into the Iraq Petroleum Company through the Red Line Agreement, ending Britain's exclusive lock on Iraqi oil. From below, nationalist movements. In Persia, resentment against AIPAC's exploitative royalty terms, the company paid Iran a pittance compared to its profits, simmered for decades. In Iraq, the 1920 revolt against British rule cost Britain £40 million and hundreds of lives. The colonies didn't want to be pipeline states. They wanted sovereignty. Here's the irony buried in the archives. The open door that America used to break Britain's Middle Eastern oil monopoly was justified in the language of free markets and fair competition. 30 years later, America would build a monopoly 3 times more powerful and use the same language to defend it. Every rising power uses openness as a battering ram against the incumbent's closed system, then locks the door behind itself. Stage 6 had begun. The monopoly wasn't shattered yet, but it was fractured, and fractures in this pattern are irreversible. The collapse, when it came, was astonishing in its speed. In 1951, Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh nationalized AIPAC's assets, the Abadan refinery, the pipelines, everything. Britain's response revealed how far it had already fallen. It couldn't act alone. London organized a global boycott of Iranian oil, froze Iranian assets, and considered military intervention. But it lacked the naval and financial power to enforce its will without American help. In 1953, the CIA and MI6 jointly orchestrated Operation Ajax, overthrowing Mossadegh and restoring the Shah, but the price was Britain's monopoly. The new oil consortium that replaced AIPAC gave American companies a 40% share. Britain had needed America to save its oil, and America took half. Then came Suez. In October 1956, Britain, France, and Israel invaded Egypt after President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, the choke point through which much of Britain's Middle Eastern oil flowed. The United States, under Eisenhower, publicly condemned the invasion and threatened to collapse the pound sterling by selling British bonds. Britain withdrew within weeks, humiliated, exposed, finished as an independent oil power. The numbers tell the story of the fall. From 50% of the world's proven reserves in 1919 to controlling the terms of none of its own supply by 1956. The Royal Navy that had inspired Churchill's oil revolution was being decommissioned. The pound sterling that had been the world's reserve currency for over a century would be devalued in 1967. AIPAC, renamed British Petroleum in 1954, as if a name change could erase the imperial origins, survived as a company, but the empire that created it did not. The lesson of Britain's oil empire: the nation that builds the system doesn't get to keep it. The system outlasts its creator, and the next power inherits not just the oil, but the playbook. Britain's entire cycle, from Churchill's coal to oil conversion to the Suez humiliation, took roughly 42 years. Remember that number, because the next empire ran the same playbook faster. Let's jump forward to 1933. The setting shifts from London and Persia to the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula. The players change. Standard Oil replaces APOC, Washington replaces Whitehall, Saudi Arabia replaces Iraq. But the pattern plays out again, stage by stage, and this time, the empire being built would dwarf anything the British had imagined. The United States didn't just want to control oil, it wanted to make oil the foundation of the entire global financial system. And it happened even faster. America in the 1930s was oil-rich at home and hungry for more abroad. The Texas fields, the California wells, the Oklahoma gushers. The United States was the world's largest oil producer. But American oil executives and strategic planners could see the math. Domestic reserves wouldn't last forever, and whoever controlled the world's largest untapped reserves would control the next century. The place was Saudi Arabia, a desert kingdom almost no Westerner could find on a map, a nation so poor that its government's primary revenue came from taxing pilgrims on their way to Mecca. King Abdulaziz ibn Saud ruled a country with no roads, no railways, no modern infrastructure, and, beneath its eastern sands, the largest oil deposits on the planet. Britain had been courting Ibn Saud, but offered too little. The British were stretched thin across Persia and Iraq, their financial capacity drained by imperial overextension. The door was open for someone with deeper pockets and fresher ambitions. What followed was the most consequential corporate-government partnership in the 20th century. Over the next 4 decades, the United States would replicate Britain's 7-stage playbook, every step in the same order, but with greater resources, sharper execution, and one critical innovation that Britain never achieved, fusing oil not just to military power, but to the global currency itself. The dollar wouldn't just buy oil. Oil would become the reason the world needed dollars. This is the story of how that happened, and how it took America roughly 40 years to build a system so powerful it seemed permanent, and less than 15 to start watching it crack. In May 1930, King Ibn Saud granted Standard Oil of California, SoCal, an exclusive 60-year concession to explore for oil in eastern Saudi Arabia. The price, £35,000 in gold, plus a loan and future royalties. SoCal formed the California Arabian Standard Oil Company, CASOC, and began drilling. The concession was a gamble. 5 years of dry wells followed. SoCal poured money into a desert that gave nothing back. Engineers drilled at Dammam in the eastern province, reaching well after well that produced only trace amounts. But American oil executives understood what British officials had understood 2 decades earlier. The resource itself was only half the equation. The strategic insight was that whoever controlled Arabian oil would control the balance of power in the post-war world. Internal SoCal memos from the mid-1930s described the concession as a national security asset, language nearly identical to Britain's Foreign Office memos from the previous generation. The pattern that had started with Churchill and APOC was repeating, with different names, a different desert, but the same underlying calculus. The nation that gets there first controls the century. Like Abadan before it, the breakthrough was infrastructure. On March 4, 1938, the Dam Nam No. 7 well, the 7th attempt, struck oil at a depth of 4,727 feet. It wasn't just oil, it was a gusher. The flow rate exceeded 1,500 barrels per day, and subsequent tests confirmed a reservoir of almost unimaginable scale. By 1940, CASOC was producing enough to warrant a refinery, a pipeline to the coast, a deep-water port at Ras Tanura, and housing for thousands of workers. In 1944, CASOC was renamed the Arabian American Oil Company, Aramco. By then, a second American oil giant, Texaco, had joined the partnership. The infrastructure build-out accelerated: pipelines, tank farms, airstrips, roads. Aramco built a parallel state within Saudi Arabia. By 1950, Saudi Arabia's proven reserves had reached an estimated 12 billion barrels, and Aramco controlled every stage of extraction, processing, and export. The Americans didn't just find oil, they built an entire petroleum civilization in the desert. Hospitals, schools, walled compounds. The infrastructure captured wasn't just wells and pipes, it was a relationship. Saudi Arabia's modernization became inseparable from American oil capital. Every new road led to a wellhead. The military enforcement followed the oil, just as it had for Britain. During World War II, Saudi oil was still a trickle compared to American domestic production, but strategic planners saw the future. In February 1943, President Roosevelt declared Saudi Arabia eligible for Lend-Lease aid, military and economic assistance previously reserved for active wartime allies. Saudi Arabia wasn't fighting anyone, but it had oil. That was enough. By 1945, the United States military had built the Dhahran airfield in eastern Saudi Arabia, ostensibly for wartime logistics, in practice a permanent American military footprint steps from the oil fields. After the war, the Truman Doctrine of 1947 and the Marshall Plan's fuel provisions locked Western Europe into dependence on Middle Eastern oil that flowed through American-controlled infrastructure. The Inter-Allied Petroleum Conference that had coordinated British oil strategy during the First World War now had its American successor, the Petroleum Administration for War, which managed global oil allocation throughout the Second World War. The machinery was different. The principle was identical. Military presence follows the resource. The troops don't leave when the fighting stops. They stay to protect the pipeline. Here's what nobody tells you about this stage. The American military presence in Saudi Arabia wasn't a response to a threat. It was the creation of a dependency. By building the airfield, by providing Lend-Lease, by positioning forces near the oil fields, the United States made itself Saudi Arabia's security guarantor. In exchange, Saudi Arabia made itself America's gas station. It wasn't a contract. It was a marriage, and like most marriages of convenience, it worked perfectly until one side started looking elsewhere. The diplomatic legitimization happened on a warship on February 14, 1945, Valentine's Day. President Franklin D. Roosevelt met King Abdulaziz ibn Saud aboard the USS Quincy in the Great Bitter Lake of the Suez Canal. The meeting lasted 5 hours. No formal treaty was signed. But the understanding reached that day became the foundation of the United States-Saudi relationship for the next 80 years. American military protection for the Saudi kingdom in exchange for reliable oil supply and preferential access for American companies. This was the moment force and commercial interest were wrapped in the flag of diplomacy. The Quincy meeting legitimized what Aramco had already built on the ground. It gave the Saudi monarchy an American security umbrella, and it gave American oil companies the political cover to operate as if Saudi Arabia were an extension of Texas. The meeting mirrored Lloyd George's maneuvering at San Remo and Paris a quarter-century earlier. Different empires, different deserts, same stage. The handshake aboard the warship was the American equivalent of the League of Nations mandate, less formal, more honest, equally binding. The consolidation took a form Britain had never achieved: pricing control. In 1950, Aramco and the Saudi government agreed to a revolutionary 50-50 profit-sharing arrangement, replacing the old flat royalty model. This seemed like a concession. In practice, it was a masterstroke. By offering producing nations a larger share of profits, the United States system made nationalization less attractive. Why seize the oil company when you're already getting half the money? The arrangement spread across the Gulf, stabilizing American control for 2 decades. Here's the detail that rewrites the whole story. The 50-50 profit-sharing deal wasn't generosity. It was inoculation. The United States Treasury allowed American oil companies to count their payments to Saudi Arabia as a foreign tax credit, meaning the money came out of the Treasury's pocket, not Aramco's. American taxpayers were subsidizing the system without knowing it. The monopoly was being maintained with public money, disguised as a corporate tax arrangement. Meanwhile, American oil companies, the Seven Sisters, controlled pricing, production quotas, and distribution for the majority of the world's traded oil. The posted price system, set in New York and London, determined what producing nations received. The monopoly wasn't territorial, like Britain's. It was financial. The system didn't need mandates or colonial administrators. It ran through boardrooms, banks, and pricing mechanisms. Stage 5 had evolved, from colonial monopoly to corporate monopoly. Harder to see, even harder to break. The fracture came, as it always does, from the nations sitting on top of the resource. The first crack, Iran, 1950-1. Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh nationalized British oil assets and threatened the American-designed profit-sharing model across the region. The CIA and MI6 responded with Operation Ajax in 1953, overthrowing Mossadegh and restoring the Shah. The open door that cracked Britain's monopoly now swung open for America. But the precedent of nationalization had been set. It couldn't be unset. The second crack, OPEC. Founded in 1960 by Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, and Kuwait, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries was explicitly created to counter the Seven Sisters' pricing power. For a decade, OPEC was largely toothless, but by the early 1970s, producing nations controlled over 55% of global production. They had the leverage, they just hadn't used it yet. The monopoly was fracturing, not from military defeat, but from the inevitable assertion of sovereignty by the nations whose oil made the system possible. Unlike Britain, America's Stage 7 didn't culminate in a single humiliation like Suez. Instead, it produced something more dangerous, a desperate improvisation that created a new system, the petrodollar, which delayed collapse but locked in a deeper dependency. By 1971, the financial foundation of American power was cracking. On August 15th, President Nixon unilaterally ended the dollar's convertibility to gold, the so-called Nixon shock, because foreign governments were draining United States gold reserves by redeeming dollars. The Bretton Woods system that had anchored the global economy since 1944 collapsed overnight. Then came the weapon. In October 1973, OPEC imposed an oil embargo against the United States and its allies. In response to American support for Israel during the Yom Kippur War, oil prices quadrupled from roughly $3 per barrel to $12 in less than 3 months. Gas lines stretched for blocks in American cities. The economy plunged into stagflation. The Seven Sisters' pricing power was shattered. America had completed its own Stage 6. The monopoly was broken. But rather than accept decline, as Britain had after Suez, the United States engineered a new Stage 5. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger negotiated a deal with Saudi Arabia in 1974. The Saudis would price all oil sales exclusively in United States dollars and invest surplus petrodollars in United States Treasury bonds. In exchange, the United States would guarantee Saudi security. The petrodollar was born. Britain's cycle took 42 years to complete. America's took 41 years from the Quincy meeting to the petrodollar deal. But the petrodollar wasn't a resolution. It was a patch, a new Stage 5 grafted onto a broken cycle. And patches don't last forever. Now here's where the acceleration becomes undeniable. Britain's oil empire took 4 decades to build and 2 decades to crumble. America's took 4 decades to build and is now in its 5th decade of managed decline. But the force that cracked both systems, the resistance from producing nations, created its own empire of leverage. OPEC didn't just fracture American control. It proved that oil could be weaponized by the other side. And the next chapter of this story, the one that brings us to 2025, begins with that weapon being sharpened. The third example isn't about a nation building an oil empire. It's about the system itself, the petrodollar architecture that emerged from the wreckage of the first 2 cycles, and the forces now dismantling it in real time. The petrodollar system, constructed between 1971 and 1975, was the most elegant mechanism of financial control ever devised. It didn't require colonies. It didn't require mandates. It required one thing: that every barrel of oil traded on international markets be priced and settled in United States dollars. That single rule, oil equals dollars, created artificial demand for the American currency that allowed the United States to run deficits, fund military operations, and maintain global dominance for 50 years. At its peak, in the mid-1970s through the 1990s, virtually 100% of international oil transactions were conducted in dollars. Every country that needed oil, which was every industrialized country on Earth, needed dollars first. To get dollars, they exported goods to America, bought United States Treasury bonds, or borrowed from dollar-denominated institutions. The entire global economy was wired through the Federal Reserve. But this system, like Britain's mandates and America's concessions before it, carried the seeds of its own destruction. It depended on two assumptions: that OPEC nations would remain loyal to the dollar, and that no rival economy would become large enough to offer an alternative. By 2025, both assumptions are failing, and the collapse of this system is happening faster than either of the previous two, not in decades, but in years. This time, the strategic resource identification wasn't about oil itself. It was about the currency oil was priced in. When Nixon closed the gold window on August 15, 1971, the dollar lost its anchor. Without gold backing, the currency needed a new source of intrinsic demand. Oil provided it. The identification was explicit. Internal Treasury and State Department memos from 1972 and 1973 discussed the need to link the dollar to a commodity the world cannot function without. The strategic insight was profound. Gold was finite and sitting in vaults. Oil was consumed and replenished, billions of barrels every year, in perpetuity. If every barrel required dollars, the demand for dollars would be functionally infinite. The United States didn't need to produce the oil. It just needed to control the currency it traded in. The identification targeted not the resource itself, but the meta-resource, the pricing mechanism. The infrastructure of the petrodollar system wasn't pipelines and refineries. It was financial architecture. OPEC's share of global oil production reached 55% by 1973, giving the cartel enormous leverage. But that leverage was channeled through dollar-denominated institutions. OPEC nations deposited their surplus revenues, petrodollars, into American and European banks. Those banks recycled the deposits as loans to developing nations. The World Bank and International Monetary Fund, both headquartered in Washington, operated in dollars. The SWIFT payment system, which processed international financial transactions, was dollar-centric. By the late 1970s, the financial infrastructure was complete. You couldn't buy oil without dollars. You couldn't get dollars without engaging with the American financial system. You couldn't engage with the American financial system without subjecting yourself to American regulations, sanctions, and oversight. The capture was total, not of wells and refineries, but of the transaction itself. Every barrel of oil, everywhere in the world, generated demand for the United States dollar. The military enforcement of the petrodollar system was the most expensive in history. The 1973 oil embargo had demonstrated that OPEC could weaponize supply. The American response was to ensure it could never happen again without American countermeasures. The Carter Doctrine of 1980 declared the Persian Gulf a zone of vital American interest and pledged military force to prevent any hostile power from controlling it. The United States Central Command, established in 1983, was built specifically to project force into the oil-producing regions. Then came the wars. The 1992-91 Gulf War, Operation Desert Storm, was explicitly about oil. When Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, he threatened Saudi Arabia's eastern oil fields and, by extension, the petrodollar system itself. The United States deployed 700,000 troops. The 2003 invasion of Iraq, whatever its stated justifications, resulted in the restructuring of Iraqi oil contracts and the denomination of Iraqi oil sales in dollars after Saddam had switched to euros in 2000. The military footprint grew. Bases in Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, Oman, Djibouti. The Fifth Fleet patrolled the Strait of Hormuz. The cost, by 2020, exceeded $6 trillion across all Middle Eastern operations. Here's what should disturb you about this stage. Saddam Hussein's decision to price Iraqi oil in euros in November 2000 was followed by invasion in March 2003. Muammar Gaddafi's proposal for a gold-backed African dinar to replace the dollar in oil transactions was followed by NATO intervention in Libya in 2011. These aren't conspiracy theories. These are documented sequences of events with documented timelines. The pattern doesn't require a shadowy cabal. It only requires that the system protects itself, and the system's immune response is military. The diplomatic legitimization of the petrodollar was the 1974 Kissinger-Saudi Agreement and the web of bilateral deals that followed. Secretary Kissinger's 1974 deal with Saudi Arabia was never a formal treaty ratified by Congress. It was an understanding, reinforced through arms sales, military training programs, and the quiet recycling of petrodollars into United States treasuries. By the 1980s, the deal had expanded. The United States sold Saudi Arabia F-15 fighters, AWACS surveillance aircraft, and billions in military hardware. In return, the Saudis maintained dollar pricing and invested hundreds of billions in American debt. Britain had needed League of Nations mandates. America had needed the Quincy meeting. The petrodollar needed only a phone call between Riyadh and Washington. The legitimization was so quiet, so embedded in financial plumbing, that most Americans didn't know it existed. That invisibility was its greatest strength and its greatest vulnerability. You can't defend a system most people don't know is there. At its zenith, the petrodollar monopoly was absolute. Through the 1980s and 1990s, virtually every barrel of internationally traded oil was priced in dollars. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves peaked at over 71%. United States Treasury bonds were the world's risk-free asset. American sanctions, backed by control of the dollar-based payment system, could cripple entire economies overnight. Iran, Iraq, Libya, Venezuela, Russia, any nation that challenged the system faced financial isolation. The consolidation was self-reinforcing. Countries needed dollars to buy oil. They earned dollars by exporting to America. They stored surplus dollars in treasuries. Those treasury purchases funded American deficits, which funded the military, which protected the oil infrastructure, which maintained dollar pricing. A closed loop, a perpetual motion machine, as long as everyone kept playing. And this is the part nobody talks about. The petrodollar didn't just create demand for the dollar, it created permission to spend. Because the world had to buy dollars to buy oil, the United States could run deficits that would have destroyed any other currency. The petrodollar was an invisibility cloak for American debt, and under that cloak, the debt grew from hundreds of billions to tens of trillions. The same question that doomed Britain's monopoly and fractured America's concessions was already being asked by producing nations. Why should we? The fractures are no longer cracks. They're fissures. The resistance to the petrodollar system began at the margins and has accelerated to the center. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 removed one of America's key Gulf allies and demonstrated that military enforcement couldn't prevent political upheaval, but the real erosion began in the 2010s and exploded after 2022. Russia, under Western sanctions after the 2014 Crimea annexation and the 2022 Ukraine invasion, began selling oil and gas in rubles and yuan. The power of Siberia pipeline delivering gas to China operates in non-dollar currency. India, the world's third-largest oil importer, began purchasing Russian crude in rupees and Emirati dirhams in 2022. China, the world's largest oil importer by 2023, launched the Shanghai International Energy Exchange in 2018 to trade oil futures in yuan. In 2023, Saudi Arabia publicly signaled willingness to accept yuan for Chinese oil purchases. The kingdom that had anchored the petrodollar for 50 years was openly considering alternatives. And then came BRICS. In 2024, the bloc expanded to include Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Iran, Egypt, and Ethiopia, a coalition representing a massive share of global oil production. The stated agenda included developing alternatives to dollar-denominated trade, the same stage that destroyed Britain's mandates and fractured America's concessions, is now targeting the petrodollar itself. And it's happening in years, not decades. 3 empires, 3 systems, 3 cycles through the same 7 stages. Britain's took 4 decades to build, and 2 to break. America's took 4 decades to build, and 4 more to reach its current crisis. The petrodollar system reached full monopoly in roughly a decade, and stage 6 hit within 40 years, each cycle faster, each collapse more compressed. Now let's talk about where we are right now, in 2025, and what stage 7 looks like when it arrives. Now let's talk about the United States in 2025. 3 times, 3 collapses, 3 identical patterns, the same 7 stages, in the same order, with the same outcome. Every single time, the dominant power believed it was different. Every single time, it was wrong. And here's the reality you need to sit with. We're not at the beginning of this cycle. We're not in the middle. By every measurable indicator, the United States has completed stages 1 through 5. We are deep into stage 6, the resistance and fracture stage. Stage 7, systemic collapse and power transfer, is what comes next. The question isn't whether the pattern will repeat. The question is how fast. Stage 1, check. The United States identified oil as the foundation of its global power system in the 1940s, and then went further than any empire before it by fusing oil to its currency in the 1970s. The strategic resource identification was the most sophisticated in history. Not the oil itself, but the pricing mechanism that made the dollar indispensable. Today, that identification is being mirrored by China. Beijing's Made in China 2025 initiative and its Belt and Road energy investments across Central Asia, Africa, and the Middle East represent the same calculus that drove Churchill to buy into APOC and Standard Oil to approach Ibn Saud. The strategic resource hasn't changed, but the rising power eyeing it has. Check stage 2, check. The financial infrastructure, SWIFT, dollar-denominated commodity exchanges, the Treasury bond market, was America's Abadan, and it's still standing. But parallel infrastructure is being built. China's cross-border interbank payment system processed $14.7 trillion in 2023, up from near zero a decade earlier. The Shanghai Oil Exchange, the mBridge digital currency project connecting central banks in China, Thailand, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia. The Belt and Roads physical infrastructure, ports, pipelines, railways, across 60 countries. Just as SoCal built a parallel state inside Saudi Arabia, China is building a parallel financial system outside America. The old infrastructure still dominates. The new infrastructure is operational. Check. Stage 3. Check. The United States maintains over 750 military bases in at least 80 countries, with the heaviest concentration in the oil-producing Gulf region. The Fifth Fleet still patrols the Strait of Hormuz. Central Command still coordinates Middle Eastern operations. The military enforcement is intact, but it's straining. The cost of Middle Eastern operations since 2001 exceeds $8 trillion according to Brown University's Costs of War project. Military recruitment is at its lowest levels since the all-volunteer force began in 1973, and the nations being protected are diversifying their protectors. Saudi Arabia has conducted joint military exercises with China and purchased Chinese ballistic missiles. The enforcement is still in place. The monopoly on protection is not. Check. Stage 4. Check. The Kissinger-Saudi deal that legitimized the petrodollar was never a formal treaty. Its enforcement depended on the relationship, and the relationship is fraying. In 2023, Saudi Arabia and Iran restored diplomatic relations through Chinese mediation, not American. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has publicly stated that Saudi Arabia's interests, not its alliances, will determine its oil pricing decisions. Just as Britain watched its League of Nations mandates become unenforceable, the United States is watching its informal diplomatic framework, the unwritten rules of the petrodollar, become optional. The legitimization is still referenced. It is no longer binding. Check. Stage 5. Check, but cracking. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has declined from over 71% in 2001 to approximately 58% in 2024, according to International Monetary Fund data. Still dominant, but the trajectory is unmistakable. The dollar's share of global trade settlement is declining even faster, with some estimates placing it below 50% for non-oil transactions. The monopoly is still the largest single position, but it is no longer a monopoly. It is a plurality, and the gap is closing. The closed loop of oil to dollars to treasuries to military to oil is still spinning, but slower with more leakage at every joint. Check, but check with an asterisk. Stage 6. We're here now. This is where we are right now. The resistance isn't theoretical, it's operational. Saudi Arabia accepting yuan for oil, Russia selling energy in rubles, India buying crude in rupees and dirhams, BRICS expanding to include the world's most important oil producers, China settling more trade in yuan than dollars for the first time in history as of March 2023. The new development bank offering loans in non-dollar currencies, central banks worldwide increasing gold reserves at the fastest pace since 1967, a hedging strategy against dollar decline. The petrodollar system that the 1974 deal built into the foundation of global finance is now being actively, openly, systematically bypassed, not by enemies alone, by allies. Saudi Arabia isn't America's adversary. It's America's original petrodollar partner. And it's diversifying, and here's the part that should make you uncomfortable. The fracture isn't being driven by enemies, it's being driven by allies. Saudi Arabia, the original petrodollar partner, is diversifying. The United Arab Emirates is diversifying. India is diversifying. These aren't hostile nations. These are countries doing the same math the United States did in the 1930s, hedging against dependence on a single system. The irony is total. The playbook used against Mossadegh, regime change for challenging the system, doesn't work when the challengers are China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, India, and Brazil simultaneously. There's no single government to overthrow. There's no single refinery to blockade. The fracture is systemic. This is Stage 6. Following the exact same sequence that preceded the collapse of British oil dominance and the fracturing of America's Seven Sisters monopoly, the pattern is repeating. We're in it. Stage 7, coming next. The stage we haven't reached yet is what happens when the fractures compound. What does it look like? It looks like the moment when a critical mass of oil trade moves permanently off the dollar, when United States Treasury bonds lose their status as the world's default safe haven. When the closed loop breaks, when the United States can no longer fund its deficits by recycling petrodollars and must either slash spending, raise interest rates to attract capital, or devalue the currency. Early warning signs are visible now. United States debt surpassed $34 trillion in 2024. Foreign holdings of treasuries have plateaued while debt issuance has accelerated. meaning America is borrowing more, but foreign governments are buying less. The gap is being filled by domestic institutions and the Federal Reserve itself. That's not sustainability. That's a timer. But the evidence doesn't stop there. The signs are everywhere, and they're accelerating. The petrodollar's share of global oil trade has declined from virtually 100% in 1975 to an estimated 80% in 2024, and the decline is steepening. Russia alone has diverted over 5 million barrels per day of production away from dollar settlement since 2022. China's yuan has overtaken the euro as the second most used currency in international trade finance. The BRICS nations collectively represent over 40% of the world's population and roughly 30% of global GDP, a larger share than the G7. Central banks added 1,037 tons of gold to their reserves in 2023, the second highest annual total on record. This isn't diversification, it's preparation. Gold is what you buy when you're losing faith in the reserve currency. India's Unified Payments Interface processed over 12 billion transactions per month in 2024, building domestic financial infrastructure that reduces dependence on dollar-denominated systems. Brazil and Argentina announced plans to develop a common currency for bilateral trade. Even France's Total Energies completed its first liquefied natural gas transaction in yuan in March 2023. But here's where it gets darker. The speed of this defection has no historical parallel. Britain lost its oil monopoly over 2 decades of post-war negotiation. America's Seven Sisters were broken over 15 years by OPEC's pricing power. The petrodollar's erosion is measurable in quarterly reports. You're watching in real time what previous generations experienced as slow historical drift. The accelerating factors are unique to this moment. Digital currencies enable instant cross-border settlement without SWIFT. Multipolar alliances provide security alternatives to American protection. And the sheer scale of non-Western economies means the alternatives to the dollar are no longer marginal. They're massive. They're organized. And they're moving faster than any previous Stage 6 in this pattern. So what does Stage 7 actually look like? Not in theory, in practice. If the pattern holds, and it has held 3 times, here's what the remaining trajectory looks like. First, a trigger event. In Britain's case, it was Suez. In the petrodollar's formation story, it was the 1973 embargo. Stage 7 typically begins with a shock, a crisis that exposes the system's fragility faster than policymakers can respond. In the current cycle, that trigger could be Saudi Arabia officially pricing a significant portion of its oil in yuan. It could be a BRICS-led commodity exchange that processes enough volume to become self-sustaining. It could be a United States debt crisis, a failed treasury auction where foreign buyers simply don't show up. Second, cascading defections. Once one major producer breaks from dollar pricing, others follow, not out of ideology, but out of self-interest. The same dynamic that turned OPEC from a toothless cartel into a market-moving force in 1973 applies here. The first defection is risky. The fifth is inevitable. Third, domestic consequences. When the dollar loses its artificial demand floor, the demand created by oil pricing, interest rates rise, import costs increase, and the cost of servicing $34 trillion in debt becomes unsustainable. Ordinary Americans experience this as inflation, job losses, and reduced purchasing power. The currency that bought the world's goods at a discount suddenly buys less. The military that was funded by global dollar demand faces budget constraints. Bases close. Alliances weaken. The loop breaks. Fourth, a new system emerges. It won't be a single replacement. It will likely be a multipolar arrangement. Yuan, rupee, digital currencies, regional settlement systems that fragments global trade into blocks. No single hegemon, no single currency ruling oil. The century of the petrodollar ends not with a bang, but with a slow, grinding fragmentation, unless a crisis accelerates it into something sharper. Now watch what happens when you project this forward. If the petrodollar's share of oil trade continues declining at its current rate, roughly 1 to 2 percentage points per year, it falls below majority share by the early 2030s. That's not a prediction. That's arithmetic. And arithmetic doesn't negotiate. 3 times it happened. 3 systems built on oil dominance, 3 collapses through the same 7 stages. Britain built its oil empire between 1914 and 1923 and watched it disintegrate between 1951 and 1956. 40 years up, a decade down, America built its oil dominance between 1933 and 1974 and has been managing decline since the 2000s. 40 years up, decline still in progress, but accelerating. The petrodollar system reached full consolidation by the mid-1980s and entered stage 6 by 2018, 30 years of dominance before the fractures began. Each cycle faster than the last, Britain's collapse was slow enough to be dignified, a managed retreat from empire. America's is fast enough to be destabilizing, an active unraveling of financial architecture. The petrodollar's decline, if it follows the pattern's acceleration, will be faster still. We're not just repeating the pattern, we're accelerating it. The same stages, the same sequence, the same outcome, but compressed. Technology, globalization, and the rise of genuine multipolar rivals have removed the buffers that slowed previous transitions. There is no graceful decline option at this speed. The pattern doesn't care about intentions. It doesn't care about policy. It cares about math. And the math of stage 6 has only ever pointed in one direction. Maybe we can do what Britain couldn't. Maybe the United States can navigate a transition that no previous oil hegemon has survived. Maybe this time really is different. Maybe the dollar's network effects, America's innovation economy, and its military reach can hold the system together through stage 7 entirely. Maybe, but the pattern says otherwise. The math says otherwise. And every empire in this story believed it was the exception. Right up until the moment it wasn't. 3 empires, 7 stages, 1 outcome. Every time, if this opened your eyes to where we actually are in the sequence, subscribe, because stage 6 isn't over, and what comes next will be the most consequential economic shift of your lifetime. The pattern is still running,